right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Aerospace Nation Speaker Series. We're really pleased that Major General Clint Q. Hinote could join us today. General Hinote is the Director of the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability, or AFWIC for short. Now, AFWIC identifies prioritized ways and means to conduct resourcing priorities based on optimizing Air Force capabilities. AFWIC also drives the integration of future operational concepts through centralized enterprise design and capability planning. Welcome, Q, and thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start off by giving you some time to summarize the critical challenges that necessitated the stand-up of AFWIC in the first place, and then a little bit on your top priorities. I think our audience knows that AFWIC has become a key influencer in developing not just new operational concepts for aerospace power, but for consequent future force design as well. So over to you.
Thanks, General Deptula, and it's great to be here. You know, it's a tough time for a lot of folks, including some of our people on our team. Lots of challenges, lots of new stressors that we're dealing with, but there's been some good things to come out of this time as well. And I think these different meetings that we have online with the Air Force Association and the Mitchell Institute are one of those really good outcomes that has happened. I hope we can continue this for a long time to come. I think this is really a great way of using the technology to get the story out. So I want to thank AFA and the Mitchell Institute for that. So what I have had to answer the question, what is AFWIC, a lot during my last 2 years. I came back from Iraq, was assigned to this new startup of an organization called AFWIC. And everybody wants to know, what is AFWIC about? So I just honestly, sometimes we struggle with that because we've been given such a big task, and how do you boil that down? So it actually came to me earlier this year. I was invited to go out to the Air Force Academy and speak to the senior class at the Air Force Academy. This was before we knew that that COVID was going to alter their entire schedule, and we thought there were 100 nights left until their graduation. So I got a chance to go speak. And I was up there telling them and, talking to them about their future. And I was saying, I'm very fortunate to be part of a team that wakes up every day thinking about your Air Force, the Air Force of tomorrow, the Air Force that you're going to inherit and that you're going to fight one day if that is necessary. And that, every generation has had to make the sacrifice of defending freedom. And we would be, I think, remiss to say that that generation would not have to do it too. So somebody's got to be their voice. And that's when it came to me that really what we wake up and do every day, we are the voice of tomorrow's airmen. And you need that, right? Because the urgency of the day and the demand signal that comes from our stakeholder community, including current operations and what the demands are from the combatant commanders, those are important. And those tend to take up a lot of the bandwidth of any staff. But somebody needs to be that voice of tomorrow's airmen as we are dealing with today's challenges. And that's what we've been charged to do. In the Army, there's the Army Futures Command. And we're on a different model than that, right? The Army Futures Command has gone to the major command level. They've gone away from Washington, D.C. We have stayed at the staff level, and we've stayed in Washington, D.C. I think there's pluses and minuses to both. We could get into that if you want to. But we're trying to maximize the influence that we have on behalf of tomorrow's airmen. So what do you have to do that? You have to appreciate the challenges that they're going to face. We do that in a lot of different ways. We have analysis and wargaming, and we read a lot of futures products. No one has a crystal ball, by the way, on the future. What we see is that there are trends, and you can think about the way those trends are going to go over time. And that gives you a set of alternative futures that you can use to appreciate the types of challenges that our future airmen are going to face. You need to have strategies and concepts with basically stories on how they will be successful in dealing with those challenges. You need to be able to lead the capability development and the force development that has to happen in order to for them to have an Air Force that is worthy of them and that they can fight and win with in the future. And then that has to be integrated across the entirety of the department's missions. And the integration piece is a really major part of what we do. So as we think about our priorities, what we're doing is we're thinking about what are the challenges they're going to face, how can they be successful, what do we have to do today so that they can be successful tomorrow. And what we've basically seen, especially given a very long evidentiary record of wargaming, is that increasingly, if we don't change our ways of fighting, then we are not going to be relevant in the types of conflicts that the National Defense Strategy says we have to be ready for. And so we do need to change. There is an imperative for change. If we don't change, tomorrow's airmen will not be able to do what we did. And so there is an imperative for change. And we wake up every morning with that sense of urgency, trying to lead the broader department in understanding the future challenges, determining what we need to do now to get to that future where our tomorrow's airmen can be successful.
Very good. Thanks for that context and insight. I think it was a very illustrative, particularly in the context of the impact on future leaders in the Air Force. And thanks for all that you and your team are doing along those lines. Now, Defense Secretary Esper no longer talks about defense increases, but instead he's just hoping for flat future defense budgets. In the worst case, a new Great Depression might mean deep defense cuts and a potential sharp decline in our ability to spend money on defense, and certainly a more dangerous world. The budgetary consequences of COVID are on everybody's mind. So let's start with COVID-19 and just what it means for the future of national defense. I want to leave this kind of open-ended for you, but what are your broad thoughts on that subject area?
Yes, sir. It's certainly something that we're thinking about literally every day. So two major trends that are shaping our future. One is there's widespread agreement in the ends of the national defense strategy. So when I go and talk with our stakeholder community, say, for example, on Capitol Hill or in the think tank world or with you guys, there's widespread agreement in what the national defense strategy is trying to do. We're awake to this idea of great power competition. We want to compete. We want to compete so well that we deter. But if we had to, we want to be able to win if deterrence fails. And so compete, deter, win against the great powers is the focus of the national defense strategy. And generally, I think people are going to want to keep that in place. But as you say, we don't have a crystal ball, but we certainly can look at the trends. And when we look at spending trillions of dollars in stimulus to recover from the COVID crisis, and we look at what that's going to take to service the national debt and how the discretionary spending is going to be allocated because of that, it makes sense for us to be a little concerned about the overall budget of the department. You know, I like to tell people, I recall the story of Willie Sutton, the bank robber. You know, people asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? And Willie Sutton said, well, it's because that's where the money is. So in the discretionary budget for the United States, the money is in the Department of Defense budget. And so it would be, I think, very logical for us to look and say, whoa, boy, given what we're doing with COVID, given that we have a broader sense of what the welfare for Americans is going to, what that's going to take, and we see the defense budget as being pretty big, it's totally logical to think that it might be under a lot of pressure. And I think that's what you see the secretary talking about. When, flat is the new up, right? If we could stay flat, we'd feel pretty good, but we're looking at a contraction in gross domestic product that generally comes with a contraction in revenues. And you would think that there's a decent chance that that means there's a contraction in the DoD budget. So if that's the case, here's what you have. You have a situation where you want to keep the ends of the national defense strategy in place, but you're probably looking at lesser means. And so, you know, there was a professor in the Army War College. His name was Art Like, and he was trying to, how do I teach this esoteric concept of strategy? And what he came up with was the three-legged stool. He said you could think of strategy as a three-legged stool where the legs all have to be about the same, otherwise your stool's out of balance. And those legs are the ends of your strategy, the ways, and the means. And then we, of course, grow up talking about ends, ways, means. So here's where you have. You got the ends that stay pretty aspirational. We're going to stand up to the great powers of the world and be able to meet them and defeat them on their front doorstep if necessary, because a lot of our friends live there. But you have a lesser means, you've got a smaller budget to be able to do. So what do? You adjust the ways. And this is the challenge for the Department of Defense and the Department of the Air Force. How do you adjust the ways in a time of what you might call austerity? Now that's an interesting word. And so what do I mean by austerity? So when we think about Western democracies that come under budgetary pressure and the relationship that they have with their militaries, what often happens, and in fact it happens in almost every case, is there is downward pressure on two major parts of the military. The first is force structure. You draw down force structure because that's some of the easiest ways that you can save money, because there's a host of things you save. The cost of people, you save the cost of using equipment, you save the cost of sustaining equipment. So lots of downward pressure on force structure. I would argue that certainly you saw some of this because you served during the height of the Cold War and then saw the decline over time in all the services. And I would argue that a form of austerity hit the United States sometime after the end of the Cold War and Desert Storm. So you saw a great downward pressure on force structure. But you also see in Western democracies a want to defer modernization, because that money's not spent yet. And so if you defer it out into the out years, we always love talking about the out years. If you defer that modernization to the out years, you can get to a much smaller budget and still seem to have, at least on paper, a good military. We have now come to the point, and I would argue that COVID is not necessarily a strategic change in the environment as much as it is an accelerant of all the trends that have been facing us for a long time. And the day of reckoning has come. I think that what this does, what COVID does, and the downward pressure on the budget, is it's going to accelerate the day of reckoning that was always facing us, which is we can no longer modernize and maintain what we have. There has got, unfortunately, we're at the point where you can't have your cake and eat it too. You're going to either keep your force structure whole and ready, or you're going to modernize. But we've pushed it off for too long. And this is especially true in the Department of the Air Force. And this is a very, very difficult message for us. And it's a difficult message for our stakeholder community. When we go to Congress and we talk about things like, what are you going to do with the replacement for JSTARS? And they of course want to keep an airborne moving target indicator effect in place until you have a new effect ready. I think COVID accelerates the day when you can't do that anymore. And that's where we are today. And so what does that mean for us? I think you're going to see us have to deal with austerity in a new way. You know, it's time for us to really put our thinking caps on and figure this thing out in new ways. And I think what this does is it opens up some possibilities for a relaxing of some of the constraints and the restraints that have faced all the services, but especially the Air Force in the last several years. All these statutory things that are in place that are floors and ceilings and and all sorts of things. I think you're going to see a possibility that we can work with our stakeholder community and get to the new ways. But between now and then, there comes I think, the stages of grief. And that's kind of what we're going to work through together as a wider community in the Air Force. And I think we've seen the beginnings of that already, and it's coming. That being said, I'm really excited about the role of air and space power in that new set of ways. You are going to want air and space power in any type of design of force so that you can achieve the National Defense Strategy objectives. Not only that, you're going to want them there early, and you're going to want them there often. And you're not going to be able to lose the effects that air and space power provide in order for the joint force to be successful. And so I feel optimistic in the long run about air and space power. I feel like the thing that we have to do now is confront the brutal facts. What is facing us at the moment? And what is facing us is the real threat of austerity. And the worst thing that could happen is for us to decide not to decide. I.e., we decide to keep the National Defense Strategy ends in place. We see the means going down, and we don't decide to change. We don't decide to adopt a new set of ways across the entire joint force, not just the Department of the Air Force. And if that were to happen, then we're on a clear trend to something, two words that I think none of us want to talk about. One of those is hollowness, that we would, our force structure would be less capable, less ready, and hollow. And then the other is irrelevance, which is the old ways will be increasingly irrelevant in the new era. And we don't want hollowness. We don't want irrelevance. And I think we're staring it straight in the face. That's why we have to be able to communicate with our stakeholder community about what it is, what changes we need to make to get to those new ways. So you have an even three legs with ends, ways, and means. Hopefully that helps us understand a little bit about where we are.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good. It's insightful. You hit upon a variety of different elements in there. You spoke primarily about the Air Force. I was going to interject that, I like to use the term now. It's not just about, it might be nice to have the Air Force there. The Air Force has become the indispensable force. And in fact, there is no joint force operation that can be conducted, any period dot, without elements of the Department of the Air Force. You can't say that about any of the other services. So that gets to the other issue that's going to make this even more complex and difficult. Is this one thing to deal with these issues inside our individual services, but we have to stop stovepiping alternatives by service. Because as you alluded to, we don't fight by services. The services don't fight. They organize, train, and equip. It's the combatant commanders that fight. So we have to start looking across service lines. The example I like to use is, for all the good reasons we're retiring, or we're requesting retiring 17 B1s in the 21 budget, for all good reasons. But one B1 can deliver the same ordnance capacity as an entire carrier battle group in a day at distance. No one's talking about retiring aircraft carriers. Again, I'm not dismissing the value beyond force projection, but I'm just saying that we've got to start looking cross service lines. And so as the the new chief has talked about, it's probably time to take a look at, and I know everyone inside the Pentagon goes apoplectic when the roles and missions terms are used. Maybe a way to do that is a little bite of the elephant at a time, and looking at particular mission areas and doing a cross-service analysis for what's best for the entire Department of Defense. Look, none of the services are going away. We need them all, okay? But anyway, it's a wonderful answer that you gave, and let's move into, let me just.
Sir, I can add to that, because I think that there's an interesting development that's going on right now that I think your audience would be quite interested in. So at the moment, there is no integration force across the joint staff, right? There is no JWIC to correspond to an AFWIC and an N7 and a Futures Command and such. However, the J7 has been re-energized to push forward two major initiatives, the Joint Warfighting Concept and the Globally Integrated Wargame Series. What those two initiatives are supposed to do is to bring us together and begin to get after a joint design. I'm kind of optimistic about that, because what I have seen so far in the core group that is talking through the Joint Warfighting Concept, and of course we participate in all of those meetings, I see a willingness to explore new ways, and that goes back to our ends, ways, means discussion. And I really am heartened by the willingness of this group to call a spade a spade. Now we'll see what happens, as we go forward. Proof is in the pudding, and we'll play a war game, and we'll play this out. We're going to play an alternative war game in the Air Force called Futures Game. We've intentionally constructed it to be a point of comparison between the Joint Warfighting Concept as it is being developed and a different form of fighting. We just want to show all the options and be able to say, upon what does it depend? And so that's happening right now. But I do want to say that our leadership has acknowledged that it's got to be a joint force design and a combined force design going forward. And then as part of the Air Force design function, our job is to work within that. And as you say, sir, and I think rightfully, air and space power play a tremendous role in that joint force design. You cannot lose space, and you have to have air power to be able to win. And if you don't have it, you lose. And I think that that's readily acknowledged by the folks who are building the Joint Warfighting Concept. And like I said, I'm pretty optimistic about where air and space power end up in that, but we'll see. It's going to be a long several months as we go through this process.
Okay, you talked about the national defense strategy maintaining its a permanence, if you will, or at least stability in terms of the ends of where we want to be able to go. And it finally acknowledged what most of us have known for a long time, and that's that we're facing the return of pure competition. Can you break down a little bit how AFWIC has gone about analyzing the operational challenge of anti-access aerial denial and what China's systems warfare approach means for U.S. operational concepts?
Yes, sir. And in fact, you're getting at some of the most pertinent and difficult questions that we look at literally every day. So you're right in that the National Defense Strategy talks about the competition between the West, our friends, our allies, and us, versus Russia and China specifically, with China being the pacing threat. And so what we've got to be able to do is think through the ways they are trying to counteract our traditional strategy. The traditional strategy is you deploy a lot of stuff, people, equipment, supplies, you operate from relative sanctuary, you start the war when you are ready. That's generally what you guys were able to do in Desert Storm. It worked out pretty well. And unfortunately, what we've seen is our peer competitors have studied that model and looked for the seams. And so they have both developed and fielded capabilities to get after those seams. So you hear that in the term anti-access. You deny the ability to deploy and get stuff forward, and area denial. You deny the ability to operate in their front yard. And so the main way they do it with all sorts of stuff, cyber power, they have space, but the main way they do it is missiles. And of course, this gets into the missile salvo competition that has been forecast literally for 30 years by folks like Net Assessment down in OSD. And, one of the most interesting things, this is the first chapter of Chris Brose's new book, The Kill Chain, talks about how Andy Marshall and his folks like Andrew Krepanevich, they were watching the maturity of the missile salvo competition in 1991 and 92. And of course, they forecasted out in many ways exactly what has happened in the intervening years. And it probably took a little bit longer than what they thought. But generally what we see is they can shoot a lot of missiles at us. And that's especially true the closer that you get to their borders. And so what we have got to be able to do is operate inside of that missile threat. So this gets into the question, the age-old question of outside versus inside, or stand-in versus stand-off, or penetrating and non-penetrating. All of those are not exactly right. And so, as an example, I don't know of any way of fighting where you don't penetrate their A2AD. So the idea that you would have non-penetrating forces makes no sense to me. Something's got to penetrate, be it the weapon, the platform, or accommodation. But when we think about inside versus outside, it really comes down to from where do you generate combat power? And of course, you're familiar with the age-old kind of circular argument that happens inside our department, where you say, okay, we're an inside force, but an inside force has to be able to generate combat power even while under attack. And that's going to be increasingly hard when they can shoot hundreds and thousands of missiles at you. Okay, and that's cost imposing on us. So we must be an outside force, and we got the best outside force in the world. We got tankers and bombers, but you can never get to the capacity you need to be able to stop a full up invasion of a friend. And so you're in this circular argument. Are we an inside force or are we an outside force? And then somebody, usually a sage at the head of the table, sits back and says, well, of course, it's both. And that's the conversation killer, because how can you argue with the sage? But unfortunately, we never get to the point of what does it depend upon. And as you and I both know, we were ingrained as we were thinking through tactics and operational art. You must say what it depends on. So here's what I think it depends on as we think about air power in the future, especially vis-a-vis the A2AD threat from China. Anybody that has ever advised foreign air forces knows that it takes a host of things to come together to generate air power. I was the commander at Kunsan Air Base. I was constantly thinking about all the different elements that my team had to pull together to get airplanes in the air and bombs on target. And it was not a simple equation. It was a lot of people that had to do their jobs well to generate that combat power. What we're going to just have to realize is that if we are, and I believe we must be, a force that generates combat power on the inside of their missile range, we call that just euphemistically insiders, you've got to be able to bring all of those elements together to generate while in combat conditions. And that is different than so many operations that we grew up on. You are not generating from sanctuary, you're generating under combat conditions. And as time goes on, that will increasingly be the case further and further back, all the way to the CONUS. I would argue that if you're generating a bomber sortie out of Shreveport right now, you better be ready for cyber attack. Because if you really think you can generate out of sanctuary, you would be wrong. But that's okay, because we have folks that are thinking about generating that combat power even while under attack from cyber. But as we move closer and closer, what we see is you've got to be able to generate under the incredible attack that could come from the A2AD. Okay, so what does that mean? It means I think that you're going to do kind of three things: short, mid, and long term. I think in the short term, you're going to create as many possibilities for generation as possible, i.e. you're going to have as many airfield options out there as possible. You're going to disperse as necessary to survive and to generate and fight. And we want to create as many targeting problems for our potential enemies as possible by that dispersal. And that involves things that you hear like agile combat employment and the experiments that we're doing with multifunctional airmen. And how can we make it such that any invasion type of maneuver is going to have to account for not just the main operating bases, but many other potential operating locations. That's the short term. Then in the medium term, I do think that we're going to get into something that looks like base defense, i.e. both active and passive defense of our main operating bases. And that means I think that you're going to see deep magazine options for either misdirecting or shooting at incoming ballistic and cruise missiles. That's just going to be something we're going to have to be able to do to generate that combat power. So that's the midterm. I think we've got to address base defense. And then in the longer term, what I see is we are going to be able to generate combat power away from fixed infrastructure, i.e. we'll be able to use things like rocket launchers and parachute recovery and airmen that are out in the field and turn quickly and get things up in new types of platforms that are software defined and very flexible. You pull them out of a box, you send them up in the air, and when they break, you put them on the side, you get another one out of the box. But you're generating combat power away from fixed infrastructure. And that's going to be critical because that multiplies the targeting problem by 10 to 100-fold for our potential enemies. And in that way, you are always able to generate a degree of inside air power as you are preserving the long-range air power, mainly through bombers and tankers, but also through other means, things like palletized munitions or long-range fires from the ground or long-range fires from the sea. And you're combining all of that together using your joint all-domain command and control effect. And you achieve what we call convergence. That was a term that came from the Army. We agree with it. And this idea of converging combat power from both the inside and the outside on the most important thing that the Joint Force Commander has to get done.
Well, that's very good. And I think as you were talking there, I'm thinking of both, because as you said, we do need both. The question is going to be, what's the proper mix? You also talked a little, you gave us some insights into portions of what this future aerospace future operating concept is like. We've heard terms like distributed decision superiority, operating at the speed of need, and many other buzzwords that are floating around. Beyond connecting and sharing data, can you put a little more specificity into the new Air Force operating concept and how it enhances or is fundamental to joint warfighting concepts?
Yes, sir, of course. And so we made a decision early on that the worst thing we could do is to write a concept, get a bunch of signatures on it, and put it on the shelf. And what we wanted was a living, breathing concept that would continually be updated as we learn new insights about the types of both competition and conflict that we're going to have to prepare our future airmen for. So we decided to kind of go back to first principles and develop a Air Force operating concept. And that Air Force operating concept, I would argue, has almost no difference between what we are thinking and what I'm seeing develop in the Joint All-Domain operations concept. JADO is you'll hear people call it. And of course, it really is pinned on this idea that the most important thing that we can do as a joint force is to be able to combine the strengths of all of us together in almost a living way, in a way that we're functioning almost as a single organism. And that when there's a stimulus over here, the response could come from any place. And that response might actually come from another domain. And that's when we start talking about multi-domain. And the idea that it would be very seamless between the stimulus and the response, and that could come through any and all domains simultaneously. How can you do that? And that's where you get the effect of joint all-domain command and control. It's the thing that makes us truly joint. You and I both know that if we were to put on paper right now a joint task force, you would have components, and those components would be the air component and the maritime component and the land component and the special operations component. You probably have a MAGTAF in there for the Marines, and you've got different other ones, maybe civil affairs and stuff. And I would argue why that is joint. It certainly is not joint in the way you're going to need to win against a China or a Russia in the future, because you're talking by phone. If you are talking by phone, you are going to lose in the future. And what we've got to be able to do is be much more seamless and much more together as a joint force in order to win. And that's where joint all-domain command and control comes in. There's no one service that's responsible for that. We're going to do our part in the Air Force, in our program of record, for Joint All-Domain Command and Control is the Advanced Battle Management System, ABMS. I know you've had Preston Dunlop on as our chief architect. He's awesome. We are so fortunate to have him on our team. He is really pushing the envelope on the technology. Our part in AFWIC is to keep the warfighting concepts feeding into the experimentation and the learning. You feel the capability to fight with, and we're going to be able to fight with this ABMS, and we're going to keep on feeding those warfighting concepts in. So early on, as we were conducting a new set of wargaming and learning campaign, we saw that the most important thing we could do is all come together across the domains. And we said JADC2 was the way to go. And this is why General Goldfein has taken it on as such an important part of his tenure as chief, pushing this idea that the most important thing is us all coming together through JADC2. But there were other things that we learned along the way too. One, you got to dominate in space. You cannot lose space and expect the joint force to win. We need access to space. That doesn't necessarily mean one orbital structure. It might mean a combined or a hybrid orbital structure, but what we absolutely see is you need to be able to have access to space to win. We also got into this question that we just talked about, from where do you generate your combat power? One of the war games that we played is we tried to defeat a pure competitor all with inside forces, and we tried to defeat a competitor all with outside forces. And we pushed both of those to the absolute breaking point. And when we did that, we learned a lot about the mix and how do you mix air forces both inside and outside. And we're going to keep on talking about that mix of generating combat power. A key part of that is next generation munitions. We cannot be the Air Force that fields 5th generation aircraft and 3rd generation munitions. We have got to be the Air Force that combines the effects needed through munitions with the platforms that can survive in that highly contested environment. And we've got some really impressive efforts going on those things. And so I'm really excited about that. And then another thing that we learned, and I'm not sure we learned it as much as we confirmed it, but you must consider logistics early on in your design. You cannot design a force and then go, okay, how are we going to sustain it? Especially under combat, even while under attack. So in one of our war games, the very first thing we did was we had a week-long seminar on, I don't want to see any design forces that you can't sustain while you're dodging missiles. And so that was a really interesting way of going. So the idea that you have to be able to do logistics even while under attack, that's a joint force problem. It's not just an Air Force problem, but the Air Force has a tremendous both stake in the outcome and role to play in that. And so really we call them the 4 points of light sometimes as our little euphemism. But the idea of you got to connect with the joint force, you have to dominate space, you've got to be able to generate that combat power both inside and outside, and you've got to be able to conduct logistics even while under attack. Those guide us, and you heard our secretary talk about that in our posture statement. And that is going to be the 4 things that we look at as we're designing this force going forward. We'll play that in our futures game, and we'll push the technologies, the organizations, the concepts forward, and we'll see where it goes. You know, I would tell you, I don't know where the journey always goes. I kind of know where we want to end up, and I know where we are today, but the journey is something that we discover one step at a time. We do that as a team, and it's actually pretty exciting.
Very good. Let me ask you one more question before we open it up to our audience participants. And that has to do with the fact that a key aspect important to any sustainable military strategy is imposing cost upon one's adversary. And having watched you and your team work through various concepts ever since AFWIC stand-up, I'm really impressed with the work that you've been executing. And I'm curious if you could please share with our listeners, to the degree that is possible, what you're thinking in this regard in the context of imposing costs on any potential adversary.
Yes, sir, and I'll try to do this without sounding like a SAS seminar. But if I do, I want to tell you some of the best the absolute best teammates we get come from the advanced studies groups like SAS, SAMSAWS, and those. And we put those folks to use. I tell you what, they come in and we really give them a lot of responsibility and help them kind of pay that education back. So as we think about what we could do to make the national defense strategy work, we think about deterrence. Of course we want to deter. We don't want to fight. So we want to be able to deter in relation with our allies and partners against our peer competitors. There's two major ways you think about deterrence. Deterrence by denial, the ability to actually stop what it is that they're trying to do to you, your allies, and your partners. Then there's deterrence by punishment, the ability to raise the cost of whatever it is they're contemplating to the point where that cost becomes unacceptable. And if you can deter by denial and deter through punishment, that's kind of the gold standard for deterrence. With folks saying deterrence by denial is often more difficult because it means you've got to be able to stop them even in their front yard as they threaten an invasion of one of your friends. And that means a lot of power projection, and that means a lot of this inside-outside discussion and all that. But you also think about what does it mean to impose cost and to impose an unacceptable cost versus a peer competitor. And those are really interesting points of view. I'll tell you what it's not. It's not hitting missiles coming from a peer competitor with another interceptor. Because that's a very expensive way of doing what it is that you need to do. And so this gets into this idea of how can you complicate their, as an example, a targeting problem by dispersal, by deception, by deep magazine types of defenses, and be able to have them say, I'm not 100% sure that I can overwhelm their defenses, even with my missile salvo as it stands today. Therefore, I probably need to build more. And that's one way of imposing cost upon our adversary. And we also think about how can you impose cost on their means of operating. So and their ways of operating. So as an example, I believe multi-domain operations is a cost imposing strategy. And why? Because you have to be able to defend everything all the time. If you're going to contemplate, let's just talk about an amphibious assault on a friend. If you're going to contemplate that, you must think about how you're going to get soldiers on the land across the ocean. And as they're crossing, they have to defend from undersea, on the sea, from space, from air, from cyber, all at the same time as we are able to bring to bear the convergence of all of those things. What that means is in order for them to have a reasonable chance of success, they're going to have to invest a lot in defense, or they're going to have to accept the incredible loss that happens when we're able to converge. That's the conundrum that we want to impose. And I would argue that this is why we think that JADC2, why the convergence of all domains onto the enemy's thrust or invasion force is so critical as we think through a future force design. If we can solve that operational problem and raise the cost for them, very unlikely they'll choose to go. And that's winning. We can compete all day long with our peer competitors. We have the people, we have the system, we can compete well. Our children and grandchildren can compete well. We just don't want to fight. And we think the best way of being able to assure our allies and deter our adversaries is this combination of deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. And we're ready to do that. And we're going to design a force that's going to do that, even in austerity. And of course, that may force some interesting choices. But even in austerity, we're going to be able to design a force that gets after that.
Well, it's very insightful. I'm reminded of the fact that the Chinese are extraordinarily calculating people. So the bottom line of what you said is inducing sufficient uncertainty into their minds as to whether they might be able to succeed or not, and you've deterred action.
That's right.
On their part. Well, listen, General Hinote, thanks again for your insights today. You guys are doing an outstanding job, and on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and all AFA, we wish you and your team at the AFWIC all the best. And by the way, congratulations on your nomination to become the A5, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy Integration and Requirements. It's a natural progression from AFWIC, and I'm really certain that we'll ask you back to join us for another Aerospace Nation session, because as you said, this isn't going away. We just plan on capitalizing on this technology to provide the kinds of insights that you have articulated to a wide audience. So before we get into the Q&A, as a reminder to our listeners, the next event in our Aerospace Nation series will be next week on the 4th of June with Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, the Joint AI Center leader and DoD CIO.